Yeah, I know, and now I've got the cat suing me for the close shave it suffered in last week's episode. So much backlash. Fortunately, I know how to fix it. Hello fellow CNCnutz, and welcome. If you watched last week's episode, you would have seen us comparing rack and pinion to lead screw. And we dabbled into the realm of backlash, you know, that problem you didn't know you had. Doesn't seem to be causing any problems, and yet now you're lying awake at night wondering how you're going to fix it. Well, this episode is going to answer that question. We're going to define backlash, we're going to measure it, and then we're going to apply backlash compensation. Now, I mentioned in the last episode that my mate John Revel in Australia wrote a macro for UCCNC which allows us to easily measure the backlash on our system. I've been busy and I've had a lash at writing one for Mac 3 and managed to do it. My first macro from scratch. So we're going to be using these macros. I'm going to show you how to install them and how to run them on the various control systems to measure the backlash, and then how to set up the backlash compensation. So before we start tracking down backlash, we first need to figure out exactly what it is. And this old XY table that I've got here, that I used to use on my drill press to convert it into a mill, demonstrates it really well. Now, when I turn the handle here, the axis moves, and as you can see, as I start turning, it immediately starts moving, no problem there. The problem occurs when we need to change direction. When I want to move it back in this direction here, I have to turn this handle about a quarter of a turn before this axis actually starts moving, and there it is, it's moving now. And then if I want to go back the other way around, I need to turn it another quarter of a turn there before the threads take up and it moves. So that's the problem. This here does not have an anti-backlash nut, it's just got a standard nut built into it, and there's a lot of backlash in here. This axis is even worse. This one here has about half a turn of backlash before the axis moves in either direction. So now we understand what backlash is. It's the number of steps we effectively lose when we reverse direction. Until the slack is taken up in the system, those steps do not translate into movement, which means we won't be moving the correct distance. Now, there are two types of backlash. There's backlash that's caused by a fault and backlash that's basically built into the system. So to explain that, here is one of the rack and pinion drives off my machine. Faults for this here would include this belt being loose or the set screw in here being loose. If the belt's loose, it's going to take more steps to take up the slack on the belt to make it reverse direction. We can easily fix that by tightening the belt. Likewise, if the set screw's loose on this here, then the stepper motor has to turn until such time as that set screw re-engages and starts driving the axis back in the opposite direction. Now, these faults must be rectified using correct methods. Don't use backlash compensation to try and fix that type of problem. Now, things that are built into the system are the backlash between the pinion gear here and the teeth of the rack, or maybe even just a small amount of slop in this joint piece here where it joins on to the axis. You get the same thing in a lead screw setup as well. If the coupler here is loose, then it may have to turn a certain amount before it re-engages with that stepper motor or with the lead screw and starts driving it in the opposite direction. So again, if you've got that sort of an issue, then you need to tighten up your couplers so that you don't have that. Things that might also cause, that might be built in, could be the fact that this here has a slight amount of twist when it comes under load, which has to be taken up before it starts moving. That, of course, can't be fixed by tightening your couplers. So now the time has come to do some measurements. For that, we're going to use the macro for UCCNC and also the macro for Mac 3. I'm going to show you how to install them and then how to use them. The first thing we need to do is install the macro. Open up your version of UCCNC and check down here for your profile name. Mine's called CNCnutz default. Next, we need to find where the macros are stored, and you'll find them on the C drive, UCCNC folder, profiles, and then look here under profiles for one named macro underscore and whatever your profile name is, in my case CNCnutz default. And here are the macros for your screen set. Simply download the macro M1040 and drag it into the folder. You've now installed it and it's ready to run. So here we have UCCNC open. To run the macro, all we have to do is type in its name, so M1040, and hit enter. That brings up a box. Which axis do you want to test for backlash? X, Y or Z? I'm going to put in the Y axis. At the end of that movement, a message comes up saying please zero your dial gauge and press OK to continue. At this time it repeats the same movement again. This is basically a test to make sure that your axis can reliably repeat its actions, and as the message that comes up now says, your dial gauge should still read 0. If not, you're either missing steps or you have some other mechanical problem. So assuming that your dial reads 0, in my case it reads about 1/1000th of a millimeter difference off 0, which to my thinking is close enough. So I'm going to hit OK, and now it runs the backlash test. This test is slightly different from the previous one, a slightly different movement, but at the end of it a message comes up saying your dial gauge should now read the amount of backlash for your axis. Enter this value into the UCCNC field, backlash field of this axis, and run the test again. I'm just going to click OK, and then we'll get that entered into the backlash field. So our calibration gave us the magic figure of 0.086. What we need to do is come into configuration, go to the Y-axis because that's the one we were fiddling with, and come down here to backlash distance in units. So just hit enable backlash and type in the figure that was on our dial, 0.086. Apply setting, save setting. Go back to run. We're now ready to repeat the test. Just under the MDI command, type in M1040, hit enter, Y-axis, and begin the test. So after our initial movement here, I reset the dial, and now the repeatability test. This time I'm getting 0, which is just ideal, and now we'll find out what their backlash number is. Well, that's pretty good, 1/1000th of a millimeter. I can live with that. Okay, time for a quick reality check on this here. When you measure anything with a dial or other measuring device, you need to know what it is you're measuring. Now, the result that I should be getting is determined by the resolution of my machine. So, the result I got was 1/1000th of a millimeter, and those of you in the US, just be aware that 1/1000th of a millimeter is 25 times smaller than 1/1000th of an inch. Now the resolution on my machine is 13/1000th of a millimeter. That means each step my axis will move 13 thousandths of a millimeter, or half a thou in old measurements. The best I can expect from the anti-backlash is half of that. So I need my backlash to get me to within 6/1000ths of a millimetre, or be about 1/4 of a thou if I'm lucky. As it turns out, it looks pretty good. Now when it comes to looking at the Z-axis here, the resolution on the Z here is 4 times the resolution of my Y-axis. So that means each step is 3/1000ths of a millimetre, so I'll be looking for an accuracy of 1/1000th of a millimetre or better. Let's see what we end up with. So we have here a reading of 30,000th of a millimetre. I'll enter that into UCCNC backlash compensation and then we'll retest. Well, that's slightly better than I expected. Let's try this with Mach 3. So before we install our macro, we first need to find out the name of our machine. And as you can see on mine, when I open Mach 3 and look down here at Profile, I see the name is CNCnutz. I now go to the C drive on my PC, to the Mach 3 folder, look down for the macros folder, and find the CNCnutz folder. In here are all the macros used in Mach 3. I'm now going to zip across here to my USB stick, and you can see here I've got 2 files, both called M1040, but one's a .txt file, and that's actually for UCCNC, and this one here, the .m1s file, is a macro file in Mach 3. I'm just going to go Control C to copy, then I go back to my macros folder, right click and go paste, and that now adds the file into the macro folder. I can close that and come back into Mach 3. By going to the MDI screen, I can type in the MDI command M1040, hit enter, and it will bring up my macro box asking me which axis I want to test backlash on. This runs exactly the same as the UCCNC one. So I've set the dial up here on the back of the rack and pinion as closer to the actual drive system itself. Let's get some test results. Now that we have our backlash figure, we can come up here to config, down to backlash, and this is where we enter our reading. For the x-axis we had 0.178. Click enable backlash, and down here it says restart program to save these settings. Go OK. We're going to restart Mach 3 and then come back and test. Now, one thing I did notice when I did the backlash readings on the x-axis is that they are twice the size of those on the y-axis. Why that is, I really don't know. I've been through and I've checked the belt tightness on the rack and pinion drive as well as the set screws, and everything looks good. So the backlash is coming somewhere either from the rack and pinion itself. Maybe there is just more backlash on there, although I've tried it in several locations along the rack there, Or it could be that there's something going on with the carriage here. This carriage is actually made out of MDF and it's almost 9 years old now. Boy, does time fly. Could be that it's loosened up over the years, which wouldn't surprise me. And it is due to be rebuilt, so hopefully when I get the rebuild done on it, I'll see an improvement. In the meantime, I'm not going to bother trying to track it down. It's probably something I will never find anyway. And it's not worrying me that much anyway. The machine runs really well, regardless of whether I have backlash compensation set or not. Now, of course, that I've got it set, this should be a slight improvement. Okay, now, if you're concerned as well about not being able to get constant readings when doing this, take a quick look at this. Now, you will have noticed that the readings were slightly different on the second run, even though nothing had actually changed on the machine. That's due in part to the resolution of this dial. This one here has 10 times the resolution of a standard dial. Most of them only have 2-digit decimal places on metric and 3.5 decimal on the imperial. This one has that extra decimal place, but that makes it 10 times the resolution, 10 times more sensitive than those other dials. You could really drive yourself around the twist trying to get everything just so. So don't do it. Be reasonable about it. Try and stay within half a step. If you don't know how much a step is, it's really simple. It's simply 1 unit, it'd be that 1 inch or 1 millimeter, divided by the number of steps. And you'll find that figure in your motor tuning settings. So in my case, it's 13 thousandths of a millimeter in the X and Y and 3 thousandths of a millimeter in the Z. Okay, so if you are interested in a dial like this one here that I've got, I'll put a link on my website to where you'll be able to find them. Just be aware they are affiliated links, so I do earn a small commission on each sale at no additional cost to you. I do, however, find this here easier to use than a conventional mechanical dial, because usually when you try turning the face of the dial to line up your 0 point, the dial starts moving all over the place and it's really hard to get it set just right. Likewise, when it comes to reading it, a digital dial is a hell of a lot easier to read than a mechanical one. Or at least it is in my opinion anyway. Now, something to be aware of is that backlash is not cumulative. That means it doesn't get worse with each successive move. If the worst I measure on my x-axis here is 1/100th of a millimeter or 5/1000th of an inch, then that's all the backlash will ever be. It does not add up with each successive move. Now you might ask, is it even worth worrying about over such small fiddly amounts? And to be honest, it's not something I've ever worried about. I've never even bothered measuring it over the last 8 to 9 years of having this machine. But after thinking about it, the dial actually does allow me to measure it, and that could perhaps show me that there might be issues with the particular axis. And John Revel sent me a couple of photos before and after backlash compensation. Now this wasn't for machining done under load, because any load you put on this here is going to flex far more than the actual backlash measurements you get. But he was using the laser attachment on his one, and you can see there's a major difference in the before and after shots. All those lines are now nice and straight, having sorted out that backlash. So definitely on a laser attachment, for sure, having that backlash compensation turned on really makes a difference. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it and maybe learned something new. If you're interested in those macro files for UCCNC and Mac 3, just follow the link in the description box below this video. It'll take you off to a write-up for this particular video where you'll find all the resources you need. Before I go, I'd like to thank John Revel for sharing his macro file for UCCNC and allowing me to share it with the rest of the community here. It's really appreciated. Thanks, John. All that remains for me to do is to thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out my website, www.cncnutz.com. In the meantime, cheers.